All right, hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Restored Mind Show. My name's Matt Cotty, and on this episode, we're going to be talking about this idea of panic attacks in the workplace, or panic attacks about unemployment, right? So, panic attacks, for those of you that have never experienced them, it is probably the highest form of anxiety one can experience. I mean, if you had to rate a continuum, from 1 to 10 of, okay, well, if 1 is, well, I'm not sure about this, this test that I've been studying for tomorrow, right? And I feel a little anxious about it. 10 is like, okay, I think my heart's about to explode outside of my chest, right? Like that's a panic attack, right? It's this huge surge of energy. And, it is incredibly uncomfortable. I myself have experienced panic attacks, and I can attest, and I've also been with many clients and worked with many clients that struggle with panic attacks. Now, panic attacks are usually there's been people that report that they happen, frequently. But a lot of times what happens is panic attacks are attached to another form of anxiety, right? So someone might have social anxiety and get a panic attack when they're in a social situation, or, someone might have, panic attacks and then become agoraphobic because they don't want to have another panic attack, right? But when we talk about panic attacks in the workplace, specifically what I'm talking about is this idea that, you could either be afraid or have had a panic attack at work, and in which case, work can become scary because you're afraid of having another panic attack, right? That's usually, when I talk with people, that's kind of the fear, is that, or the anxiety is this idea of having another panic attack at work, or maybe you've had panic attacks elsewhere, right? And at that point, you're afraid that it could happen at work, right? So let's talk about that first. And the trick with panic attacks, right, is that there's this phrase that I constantly say, and again, I want to definitely say it here, right? And it's this idea that what you resist persist, right? And it's just so true when it comes to feelings and panic attacks, right? And what happens with panic attacks is that we become afraid of experiencing that kind of energy again. And what happens is then we try to control our environment to make sure that that doesn't happen. The problem is that when we do that, it becomes, our lives become more and more limited, right? So oftentimes I've seen people quit jobs, right, because they're afraid they might have a panic attack, and they'll take a job they necessarily don't want just because they don't want to have a panic attack. And, some people might argue that that's a good solution, right? Me, on the other hand, because having lived, through a time of anxiety in my life where it really was damaging my life, I don't agree with that. I take the full stance that, like, we cannot let anxiety control or limit any part of our life, right? And that's really what the battle of anxiety is, right? A lot of us think anxiety is a battle, or OCD and anxiety is a battle when it comes to thoughts or feelings. But the battle really is who's really in control of your life? Is it the fear, or is it you, right? And if you're allowing the fear to dictate your life, you're not in control, right? And that's just the hard reality. And a lot of us, many people live their entire lives like that, They're just always living according to fear, right? And that leads to, a very limited way of living. And so when it comes to the idea of having a fear about having panic attacks at work, even if you've had one, the trick to it is to go the complete opposite route. And I know this is going to sound a little crazy, but this is really, my experience of how you overcome and how you get through a panic attack is that you can't be afraid of having one. You have to be willing to face that fear of, okay, you know what, maybe that will happen. Right. And really be willing to meet it head on. Right. And that's, one of the things, that's why, like, in my, when I work with anyone, right, we teach an aggressive approach about dealing with fear and anxiety, because there can only be one real, real aggressor in this fight. You're either going to be the one taking the fight too, or getting the fight brought on you. And when it comes to panic attacks, you have to be willing to say, okay, you know what? If it happens, it happens, and go do it anyway. Right? If you're afraid of having a panic attack at work, okay, you know what? I'm going to go to work, and if it happens, it happens, right? And be willing to entertain that uncertainty and go through your day anyway. Now, if the panic symptoms come on, one of the worst things we can do is try to push those symptoms away, try to suppress them, right? Because essentially what happens, it's like taking a big beach ball and stuffing it underwater. Well, what's going to happen, right? It's just going to shoot up to the surface. And in that case, in the same way with panic attacks, is that we have to be willing to let them come on, realize that they're temporary, right? There is no feeling you've ever felt that's been permanent. Feelings are always temporary, and that it will pass with time. It cannot hurt you, right? That willingness to stand there and feel it fully is a very, very critical part of that conquering when the panic attack surfaces. So at work, you might be in a meeting and you might feel the symptoms come on, and the best thing you can do is just to stay and not try to do anything, not run out of the office, but to stay calm, stay present, observe the feelings, realize that they're not you, they're something that you are experiencing, right? They're separate of you, and that they will pass in time. And that willingness to separate yourself from your feelings and feel them head on is just so critical to your success when it comes to navigating panic attacks. Now, in the second thing I want to talk about is having panic attacks, about being unemployed, right? And I know that a lot of people right now are in that situation, right? A lot of people lost jobs unexpectedly, suddenly. And what happens is that like I was talking about last week, is that the mind just runs with that, right? I mean, and then it creates all these other problems, right? So, if you currently are unemployed or looking for a job, and I don't even like to say that, I like to say just in transition, right? Because you're just in this space between your old job and your new job. That's it, right? And in many ways, I try to encourage people to enjoy that space, because oftentimes it's very short-lived, and people will look back on times where they're unemployed and be like, man, I wish I would have done this. The courageous thing to do is actually enjoy that time and trust that good things are coming and that the next door will open. And if you actually have that trust in that, you can actually enjoy this time that you have, right? But sometimes, these panic attacks will arise. And, in this situation specifically, my thought is that panic is oftentimes like just this buildup of energy, right? And it kind of starts with little thoughts that are just going, and then all of a sudden, it kind of feeds, and then it grows and grows and grows, and then it's just like this volcano erupts. Now, one of the things is panic attacks can come on very sudden. You could be driving, you could be feeling fine, you could be sitting there watching a movie, and all of a sudden these symptoms and these sensations can just start kind of onsetting out of nowhere. And it can be very scary, right? I mean, if we think about it, it is the same exact response that you would have if there was something, life-threatening right in front of you, if a lion was running at you, right? That stress response is the same response you're feeling. And you're feeling it at like a level 10, right? When I talked about panic, right? It's a level 10 experience. So, but again, when you can look around and evaluate and say, okay, there's nothing wrong, that's what part of what makes panic attacks so scary for people, is because that same energy, if you saw a threat in front of you, you would use that energy to, fight or flee, a threat. So if a lion was coming at you, you'd use that surge of energy. Your body would use it to run faster, to fight harder, and all this stuff to survive. But with panic attacks, what happens is that onset of energy happens, and there's no threat, and therefore, there's nothing to do, right? So your body's like, well, what's going on? What do I do? And just like in the same way, though, the trick with panic attacks is to not do anything to suppress or get rid of the feelings, but instead to allow them to surface. And again, I know that sounds counterintuitive, and we explain this in depth and really go into depth on this in our program at Restored Minds with overcoming OCD and anxiety. We have a whole section on panic attacks, and many people who've successfully used those tools to navigate panic attacks to the point where they're able to go through them and eventually get to the point where they subside and they don't happen, because if you experience them correctly, that's how your body knows what to do with that energy if you trust it. And that is, again, part of, the same part of anxiety that always happens is that a lot of our problem comes from this idea that we try to control something that can't be controlled, whether it's the future, whether it's our thoughts, whether it's our feelings. And the more we try to control something that can't be controlled, the more turmoil we get into, right, with ourselves. And so the key thing that I really want to just make sure we drive home in this episode is that when those feelings of panic onset, to move with them and towards them, not away from them. Because if you move away from them, what you resist persists, it will get worse. And that's what happens with panic attacks. And then also, if you're afraid of having them, right? And we'll probably talk about this in another episode. It's so imperative that you don't go into avoidance behaviors because you're afraid of having one, because that just reinforces the idea that you won't be able to handle it, and your life just will become more and more limited. So, that's all I really want to talk about in this episode. If you found this helpful, as always, please subscribe, like, follow, and share this with someone that might find it helpful. It's always great for us to get this stuff out to people to help. We also have additional resources for you or people that are struggling over at our site, restoredminds.com. And we just want to thank you for tuning in this week. We hope this helped you a lot, and we look forward to continuing this series next week as we're probably going to move in to talk more about panic attacks. So thank you, and I hope you have a great day.